Sometimes the cruelest judgments fall upon the purest hearts, and sometimes the children we choose to love become the greatest blessings of our lives. I'm Eleanor, and I've spent my life collecting stories that prove love is not defined by blood but by the choices we make when no one is watching. Yesterday, while organizing estate papers at the Hartford Historical Society, I discovered a worn leather journal tied with a faded blue ribbon, hidden inside a flour barrel that had been donated from an old bakery. Inside were letters that tell one of the most beautiful and heartbreaking stories of sacrifice I have ever encountered. This is the true story of Clara Whitfield, a young woman who disappeared for 4 years and returned with a baby in her arms to a town that condemned her without knowing the truth, and the secret that nearly destroyed her before revealing the depths of human goodness that still existed in a world too quick to judge. Have you ever been wrongly accused of something that changed how everyone saw you? Have you ever made a sacrifice that no one understood but you knew was right? Share your story in the comments, because Clara's journey will show you that sometimes our greatest trials prepare us for our most beautiful victories, and that love has the power to transform not just lives but entire communities when it is pure and selfless. Millbrook, Connecticut, in the golden autumn of 1841, was the kind of small town where church bells marked the hours, where everyone knew their neighbor's business before their neighbor knew it themselves, and where reputations were built over decades but could crumble in a single conversation whispered across a garden fence. The leaves on the maple trees lining Main Street had turned brilliant shades of orange and red, creating a canopy that filtered the afternoon sunlight into patterns of gold and shadow that danced across the cobblestone streets where merchants called out their daily specials and children played with hoops and sticks until their mothers called them home for supper. Clara Whitfield had grown up in this town where tradition and moral certainty governed daily life, where young women were expected to marry well and live quietly, and where any deviation from accepted behavior was met with swift social judgment that could last generations. At 23, Clara possessed the kind of gentle beauty that came from inner peace rather than vanity, with warm brown hair that she wore simply braided, kind blue eyes that seemed to find goodness in everyone she met, and hands that were strong and capable from years of working in her father's bakery where she had learned not just the craft of bread making but the art of bringing comfort to others through food made with love and attention to detail. The Whitfield Bakery on Elm Street had been the heart of Millbrook's community for over 30 years, a place where neighbors gathered not just to buy their daily bread but to share news, seek comfort during difficult times, and celebrate life's joys with pastries that had become legendary throughout the Connecticut River Valley. Clara's father, Samuel Whitfield, had built his reputation as much on kindness as on the quality of his baked goods, extending credit to families during hard times, providing free bread to widows and orphans, and treating every customer with the respect and warmth that had made his bakery more than a business but a true community institution. Clara had worked beside her father since childhood, learning not just the technical skills of measuring flour and kneading dough but the deeper wisdom of service and sacrifice that had made the Whitfield name synonymous with generosity and integrity throughout Millbrook and the surrounding farming communities that depended on the town for supplies and social connection. The love story between Clara and Thomas Hale had developed naturally and beautifully over several years, beginning with shy smiles exchanged when Thomas came to the bakery to buy his weekly bread, progressing through tentative conversations about books they had both read and dreams they shared for the future, and deepening into the kind of steady, reliable affection that promised a lifetime of happiness built on mutual respect and shared values. Thomas was a skilled carpenter and woodworker whose craftsmanship was sought after by families throughout the region who wanted furniture and household items that would last for generations, combining beauty with functionality in ways that reflected both his artistic vision and his practical understanding of how people lived and worked. At 27, Thomas had established himself as one of Millbrook's most respected young men, known for his honesty in business dealings, his willingness to help neighbors with projects that went beyond his paid work, and his quiet but firm moral principles that made him someone parents pointed to as an example of what they hoped their sons would become. His courtship of Clara had been conducted with appropriate discretion and genuine affection, marked by Sunday afternoon walks, shared meals with both families, and conversations about the future they hoped to build together that would combine his craftsmanship with her gift for hospitality in ways that would contribute to their community's well-being. The engagement between Clara and Thomas had been announced during the spring of 1837 with celebrations that reflected the entire town's happiness at seeing two of their finest young people find love and prepare for marriage that would strengthen families and community bonds that had been generations in the making. Their wedding had been planned for the following autumn, with Clara spending months preparing her trousseau and learning from older women the skills she would need as a married woman managing her own household, while Thomas had been building the house on Cherry Street where they would begin their married life surrounded by neighbors who had watched them grow up and who looked forward to watching their children grow up in turn. But during the summer of 1837, Clara had received a letter that would change the course of her life in ways that no one in Millbrook could have imagined, a letter that came from her dearest childhood friend, Sarah Morrison, who had moved to Boston after marrying a merchant whose business required them to live in the city but who had maintained close correspondence with Clara despite the distance that separated their very different lives. Sarah's letter had contained a desperate plea for help that Clara could not ignore, asking her to come to Boston immediately to assist with a situation that Sarah could not explain in writing but which threatened to destroy her life and required the kind of moral support that only a true friend could provide. Clara's decision to postpone her wedding and travel to Boston to help Sarah had been difficult and controversial, requiring her to overcome Thomas's concerns about the appropriateness of an unmarried woman traveling alone to a distant city and her father's worries about leaving the bakery during one of their busiest seasons when harvest celebrations and autumn weddings created demand for specialty items that only Clara's skill could produce. The town's reaction to her sudden departure had ranged from understanding among those who knew her character and trusted her judgment to speculation among others who wondered what kind of emergency could be so serious that it required such dramatic disruption of carefully laid plans and established expectations. Clara's departure from Millbrook on a gray September morning had been emotional and difficult, marked by tearful farewells with Thomas and her father, promises to return as quickly as possible once Sarah's crisis had been resolved, and assurances to neighbors and friends that her absence would be temporary and that her wedding to Thomas would simply be delayed rather than cancelled. Thomas had given her a small wooden cross that he had carved himself, asking her to carry it as a reminder of his love and his prayers for her safe return, while her father had pressed into her hands a purse containing more money than she had ever carried, along with instructions to write frequently and to remember that home would always be waiting for her no matter how long her absence might last. The journey to Boston had taken Clara into a world that was vastly different from the quiet rural life she had always known, exposing her to the bustling commerce, social complexity, and moral ambiguity of city life where traditional values sometimes conflicted with practical necessities and where people faced choices that were unknown in small communities where everyone knew everyone else's history and character. Sarah's situation, which Clara discovered upon her arrival, was far more complicated and morally challenging than anything her sheltered life in Millbrook had prepared her to understand or address, involving secrets, betrayals, and impossible choices that tested the limits of friendship and Christian charity. Sarah Morrison had been living a lie for years, trapped in a marriage to a man who had seemed respectable and successful when she met him but who had gradually revealed himself to be someone whose business dealings were questionable and whose personal character was corrupt in ways that had made Sarah's life increasingly difficult and dangerous. During the months before Clara's arrival, Sarah had discovered that her husband was involved with another woman, a relationship that had produced a child whose existence threatened to destroy not only Sarah's marriage but also her reputation and social position in Boston society, where such scandals could make it impossible for a woman to maintain respectability or economic security. The crisis that had prompted Sarah's desperate letter to Clara had been her discovery that she was pregnant herself at the same time that her husband's other woman was preparing to give birth, creating a situation that would expose his double life and destroy multiple lives unless some solution could be found that protected the innocent while addressing the consequences of choices that had already been made. Sarah's emotional state had been fragile and desperate, torn between her Christian duty to preserve her marriage and her very human desire to escape from circumstances that were becoming intolerable and potentially dangerous for both herself and any child she might bring into such a morally compromised situation. Clara's response to Sarah's crisis had been characteristic of her generous nature and strong moral principles, offering not just emotional support but practical assistance that went far beyond what most friends would have been willing or able to provide in such difficult circumstances. Clara had helped Sarah navigate the legal and social complexities of her situation while also providing the kind of spiritual and emotional guidance that helped Sarah make decisions based on what was right rather than what was easy or convenient. During the weeks that Clara spent in Boston, she had witnessed aspects of human nature and social reality that challenged many of her assumptions about how people lived and how moral choices were made in circumstances where traditional guidelines seemed inadequate or impossible to follow. The resolution of Sarah's immediate crisis had required Clara to remain in Boston much longer than originally planned, as the legal and practical aspects of separating from a husband whose business affairs were entangled with criminal activities proved to be complex and time-consuming, requiring the assistance of attorneys and court proceedings that could not be rushed or simplified. During this extended stay, Clara had been forced to find work to support herself, discovering that her skills as a baker were valuable in a city where quality baked goods were in demand but where competition was fierce and working conditions were often harsh for women who needed to earn their own living. Clara's letters home during this period had been increasingly infrequent and brief, constrained by her inability to explain the full complexity of her situation without betraying Sarah's trust and by her growing realization that her absence from Millbrook was creating problems that might have lasting consequences for her relationships with Thomas and her father, as well as her reputation in the community that had always been her home and her identity. The demands of helping Sarah while supporting herself in an unfamiliar city had left Clara with little time or energy for maintaining correspondence that would have reassured those who loved her and worried about her welfare during what appeared to be an increasingly mysterious and troubling absence. The tragedy that would change Clara's life forever had occurred during her second year in Boston, when Sarah's fragile emotional state and the stress of legal proceedings had combined with complications from her pregnancy to create a health crisis that had required intensive medical care and constant nursing attention that Clara had provided despite her own exhaustion and the financial strain of maintaining two households on her modest earnings. Sarah's death during childbirth had left Clara not only grieving the loss of her dearest friend but also responsible for the care of a newborn baby whose father had disappeared rather than accept responsibility for his actions and whose only other relatives had made it clear that they wanted nothing to do with a child born from such scandalous circumstances. Clara's decision to adopt Sarah's baby had been made without hesitation despite her understanding of the difficulties and judgments that such a choice would create, particularly when she eventually returned to Millbrook, where no one would know the true circumstances of the child's birth or her own role in trying to help a friend in desperate need of support and protection. Clara had named the baby Samuel after her own father, determined to honor both the child's need for love and security and her own father's example of generosity and moral courage that had shaped her understanding of what it meant to live according to Christian principles even when such living required personal sacrifice. The 2 years that Clara had spent in Boston caring for little Samuel while working to support them both had been the most difficult of her life, requiring her to develop skills and strength that her protected upbringing in Millbrook had never demanded, while also dealing with the emotional challenges of single motherhood in a city where such circumstances carried significant social stigma and practical disadvantages. Clara's work as a baker in various establishments had provided enough income to maintain a modest but clean apartment where she could care for Samuel while earning the money necessary for their survival, but the constant struggle to balance work responsibilities with childcare had left her physically exhausted and emotionally drained in ways that aged her beyond her years. Clara's correspondence with home had virtually ceased during this period, partly because of the practical difficulties of managing work and childcare without assistance, and partly because of her growing awareness that explaining her situation honestly would create more problems than solutions, while any deception would violate the principles of honesty and integrity that had always governed her relationships with those she loved. The silence that had developed between Clara and her family in Millbrook had been painful for everyone involved, creating anxiety and speculation among those who loved her while leaving Clara increasingly isolated from the community and relationships that had always been her source of strength and identity. The decision to return to Millbrook had been prompted by a letter from a neighbor informing Clara that her father's health was declining and that his mental faculties were showing signs of the confusion and memory loss that sometimes affected elderly people, creating concern among those who knew him that he needed family care and supervision that only Clara could provide. The letter had made it clear that Samuel Whitfield had been asking for Clara constantly, unable to understand why she had been away for so long and becoming agitated when reminded that she was in Boston helping a friend with unspecified problems that seemed to have no resolution or end point. Clara's preparation for returning home had been complicated by her awareness that arriving with a child would create questions and judgments that would be difficult to address without either revealing secrets that were not hers to share or allowing misunderstandings that would damage her reputation and relationships in ways that might never be fully repaired. Clara had struggled with the decision of whether to try to place Samuel with adoptive parents in Boston who could provide him with a normal family life unmarked by scandal, or to bring him to Millbrook and face whatever consequences might result from her choice to protect and care for a child whose parentage could not be explained without destroying the reputation of someone who was no longer alive to defend herself. The journey back to Millbrook in the autumn of 1841 had been both eagerly anticipated and deeply dreaded, as Clara looked forward to seeing her father and returning to the community that had always been her home, while also fearing the reactions and judgments that her return with an unexplained child would inevitably provoke among people who had known her since childhood and who had certain expectations about her character and behavior that her current circumstances seemed to contradict. Clara had hoped that her father's need for care and the passage of time might have reduced community interest in her personal affairs, but she had also understood that returning with a child would raise questions that would not be easily dismissed or forgotten. Clara's arrival at the Millbrook train station on a cold November morning had been witnessed by several townspeople who had gathered to meet the daily train and who immediately noticed not only Clara's return after 4 years of absence but also the baby she carried in her arms, A sight that had sent shockwaves through the community and prompted immediate speculation about the circumstances that had led to such an unexpected and seemingly scandalous situation. The whispers that had begun at the train station had spread throughout the town within hours, creating a buzz of gossip and judgment that had made Clara's homecoming far more difficult and painful than the emotional reunion with her father that she had been anticipating during her long journey home. The reunion with her father had been both joyful and heartbreaking, as Samuel Whitfield's obvious delight at seeing Clara again had been coupled with confusion about where she had been and why she had been away for so long. His questions about the baby revealing the mental confusion that had been developing during her absence, while his clear love for her had remained unchanged despite his inability to understand the circumstances that had brought her home with responsibilities and complications that he could not comprehend. Clara's assessment of her father's condition had confirmed that he needed constant care and supervision, making it clear that she could not consider leaving Millbrook again even if the community's reaction to her return made remaining there difficult and painful. The social reception that had greeted Clara's return had been far colder and more judgmental than anything she had experienced during her years of struggling alone in Boston, as neighbors who had once treated her with warmth and respect now regarded her with suspicion and disapproval that reflected their assumptions about what her prolonged absence and return with a child must mean about choices she had made and values she had abandoned. The speed with which gossip had spread throughout Millbrook and the surrounding communities had been both impressive and devastating, creating a network of speculation and judgment that had reached even people who had never known Clara personally but who felt qualified to express opinions about her character and morals based on incomplete information and social prejudices. Thomas Hale's reaction to Clara's return had been perhaps the most painful aspect of her homecoming, as the man who had once loved her enough to plan a lifetime together had been unable to overcome his shock and disappointment at discovering that the woman he had waited for had apparently chosen a very different path than the one they had planned to walk together as husband and wife. Thomas's inability to look at Clara without obvious pain and confusion, his awkward attempts to be polite while clearly struggling with emotions that ranged from hurt to anger to bewilderment, had demonstrated the extent to which her absence and return with an unexplained child had damaged not only her reputation but also the most important relationship in her personal life. The practical consequences of the community's judgment had been immediate and severe, as potential employers had declined to hire someone whose moral character was questionable. Former customers had stopped patronizing any business associated with Clara's name, and social invitations that had once been routine had ceased entirely, leaving Clara increasingly isolated from the community life that had once provided meaning and purpose to her existence in Millbrook. Clara's attempts to restart the family bakery had been hampered by both her father's declining health and the community's reluctance to purchase goods from someone whose reputation had been compromised, forcing her to consider whether remaining in Millbrook was feasible or whether she should accept that her choices had made it impossible for her to rebuild her life in the place where she had grown up. The establishment of a home-based bakery business had been Clara's attempt to create economic security while caring for both her father and young Samuel, requiring her to work longer hours than ever before while dealing with the additional challenges of maintaining a household and managing the complex needs of both a confused elderly man and an active toddler who required constant supervision and attention. Clara's days had begun before dawn with baking that needed to be completed before Samuel woke up, had continued through morning deliveries to the few customers who were willing to overlook community gossip in favor of quality baked goods, had included afternoons spent caring for her father and managing household responsibilities, and had ended with evening work preparing for the next day's baking while Samuel slept. The financial pressures of maintaining a household on limited income while providing appropriate care for her father and Samuel had been constant and wearing, requiring Clara to make sacrifices that included not only luxuries she might have enjoyed but also necessities that she postponed or did without in order to ensure that those who depended on her received what they needed for health and safety. Clara's clothing had become worn and patched. Her own nutrition had suffered from her practice of ensuring that others ate first and best, and her health had been affected by the combination of physical exhaustion, emotional stress, and inadequate rest that characterized her daily existence during this difficult period. The loneliness that had accompanied Clara's return to Millbrook had been perhaps more difficult to bear than the practical hardships, as she had found herself cut off from the social connections and community relationships that had always provided emotional support and personal fulfillment, leaving her with only her father's confused companionship and young Samuel's innocent affection to sustain her through days that were often marked by stares, whispers, and obvious avoidance from people who had once been friends and neighbors. Clara's attempts to participate in church services and community events had been met with polite but cold responses that had made it clear that her presence was tolerated rather than welcomed, creating painful reminders of how completely her social position had changed as a result of choices that had been motivated by love and duty rather than selfishness or moral failure. The strength that had enabled Clara to continue despite these difficulties had come from her conviction that she had made the right choices even if those choices had consequences that were more severe than she had anticipated, from her love for Samuel who brought joy and purpose to her life even in the midst of hardship, and from her faith that God understood her motivations even if her community did not. Clara's prayers during this period had focused not on asking for relief from her difficulties but on requesting strength to continue serving those who needed her care and on seeking forgiveness for any selfishness or pride that might have influenced her decisions, demonstrating the spiritual maturity that had developed through suffering and service to others. The turning point in Clara's situation had begun with small changes in community attitudes that had developed gradually as a few individuals had begun to question whether the harsh judgments that had been passed on her were fair or based on sufficient evidence to justify the social isolation and economic hardship that had been imposed on someone who had previously been known for her kindness and moral character. These initial doubts about the appropriateness of the community's treatment of Clara had been fostered by observations of her devoted care for her father, her obvious love for the child she was raising, and her continued demonstration of the personal qualities that had once made her one of Millbrook's most respected young women. Mrs. Elizabeth Hartwell, one of Millbrook's most influential and respected elderly residents, had been among the first to express concerns about the community's treatment of Clara, pointing out that passing judgment without knowing all the facts was inconsistent with Christian principles and that the isolation being imposed on Clara was also affecting her innocent father and child who deserved compassion regardless of any mistakes Clara might have made. Mrs. Hartwell's willingness to speak publicly in defense of more charitable attitudes toward Clara had carried significant weight because of her own unquestioned moral authority and her reputation for wisdom in matters involving community relationships and social harmony. The arrival in Millbrook of Mrs. Evelyn Moore, a widow traveling through Connecticut on her way to visit relatives in Springfield, had been the catalyst for revelations that would completely change the community's understanding of Clara's situation and transform judgments that had been based on assumptions rather than facts. Mrs. Moore had taken lodging at the boarding house operated by Mrs. Hartwell, and during conversations about community news and local personalities, she had learned about Clara's story and the speculation that surrounded her 4-year absence and return with a child whose parentage was unknown and unexplained. Mrs. Moore's reaction to hearing about Clara's situation had been immediate recognition of names and circumstances that connected to events she had witnessed in Boston, where she had been living with her late husband until his death earlier that year had prompted her decision to return to New England to be near family during her period of mourning and adjustment to widowhood. Mrs. Moore had known Sarah Morrison and had been aware of the tragic circumstances that had surrounded her death, including the friend from Connecticut who had cared for her during her final illness and who had taken responsibility for her orphaned child when no other family members had been willing to accept such responsibility. Mrs. Moore's decision to share what she knew about Clara's actual circumstances had been motivated by her outrage at learning that someone who had demonstrated such extraordinary Christian charity was being punished by a community that had completely misunderstood her actions and motivations. Mrs. Moore had arranged to speak publicly about Clara's true story during a community gathering at the church, using her status as an outsider with no personal interest in local conflicts to lend credibility to revelations that might have been dismissed if they had come from someone with closer connections to those involved. The revelation of Clara's true story during Mrs. Moore's presentation to the community had created a dramatic reversal in public opinion that had been almost as swift and complete as the original judgments that had been passed against her, as townspeople had realized that their assumptions about her character and behavior had been not only wrong but also cruelly unjust to someone who had sacrificed her own comfort and reputation to care for a friend in desperate need and to protect an innocent child from abandonment and neglect. The shame that many community members had felt upon learning the truth about Clara's actions had been accompanied by admiration for the depth of her compassion and the strength of her moral principles that had guided her through years of difficulty without complaint or self-pity. Thomas Hale's reaction to learning the truth about Clara's absence and return had been perhaps the most dramatic of all, as the man who had loved her and felt betrayed by what he had believed to be evidence of her moral failure had suddenly understood that her actions had demonstrated exactly the kind of character and values that had made him fall in love with her in the first place. Thomas's realization that he had failed to trust the woman he claimed to love, and that his doubts about her character had added to the suffering she was already enduring as a result of her generous choices, had filled him with remorse that had motivated immediate efforts to make amends for his lack of faith and to demonstrate that his love for her had survived despite the misunderstandings that had temporarily separated them. The community's efforts to make amends for the injustice that had been done to Clara had included not only public apologies and expressions of admiration for her character but also practical assistance that had helped her re-establish the bakery business and improve the quality of life for her father and young Samuel. Neighbors who had once avoided Clara had begun making special efforts to purchase her baked goods, to offer help with household tasks and childcare, and to include her in social activities and community events from which she had been excluded during the months when she had been unjustly judged and socially ostracized. Thomas's courtship of Clara during this period of community reconciliation had been conducted with a maturity and depth of understanding that had been absent from their earlier relationship, as both of them had learned important lessons about love, trust, and the importance of standing by those we claim to care about even when circumstances make such loyalty difficult or socially uncomfortable. Thomas's renewed proposal of marriage had been accompanied by his sincere desire to adopt Samuel legally and to raise him as his own son, demonstrating that his love for Clara included acceptance and commitment to all aspects of her life and responsibilities. The wedding of Clara and Thomas had been celebrated by the entire community as both a joyful personal event and a symbol of the power of truth to overcome misunderstanding and the importance of redemption and second chances in creating stronger relationships and more compassionate communities. The ceremony had been marked by expressions of community support that had demonstrated how completely attitudes had changed and how deeply the townspeople regretted their earlier harsh judgments that had caused unnecessary suffering for someone who had deserved their admiration rather than their condemnation. But perhaps you're wondering how it feels to be judged so harshly for doing what you knew was right in your heart. Clara's story shows us that sometimes our greatest acts of love are misunderstood by those around us, but that truth has a way of breaking through even the thickest walls of prejudice and assumption. Her willingness to sacrifice everything for a child who wasn't hers by blood but was hers by choice teaches us that family isn't just about genetics, it's about the love we choose to give when no one would blame us for walking away. If you've ever been misjudged or if you've had to make a sacrifice that others didn't understand, I'd love to hear your story in the comments. Your experiences remind us all that we're not alone in facing difficult choices, and that courage comes in many different forms. The early years of Clara and Thomas's marriage had been marked by the kind of happiness and contentment that comes from relationships built on complete honesty, mutual respect, and shared commitment to values that prioritized love and service to others above personal comfort or social convenience. Their household had become a center of warmth and hospitality that had reflected Clara's natural gifts as a homemaker and Thomas's skills as a provider and father, creating an environment where Samuel had thrived and developed into a bright, loving child who had brought joy not only to his adoptive parents but to the entire community that had watched his transformation from an object of gossip into a beloved member of their society. The success of the rebuilt Whitfield bakery had exceeded even Clara's hopes, as the combination of her exceptional baking skills, Thomas's business acumen, and the community's desire to support someone they had come to recognize as a person of extraordinary character had created demand that had required expansion of facilities and employment of additional workers who had learned from Clara's example about the importance of quality, service, and treating every customer with respect and kindness. The bakery had become not just a successful business but a gathering place for community members who had appreciated the atmosphere of warmth and welcome that Clara and Thomas had created, demonstrating how individual acts of kindness and integrity could have positive effects that extended far beyond immediate circumstances. Clara's relationship with her father during his final years had been a source of both joy and sorrow, as his periodic moments of mental clarity had allowed him to express pride in the woman she had become and gratitude for the care she had provided, while his growing confusion and physical frailty had required increasing levels of attention and assistance that Clara had provided willingly despite the demands such care had placed on her time and energy. Samuel Whitfield's death had been peaceful and dignified, surrounded by the love of family and community members who had recognized him as one of Millbrook's most valuable citizens and who had appreciated the legacy of kindness and service that he had passed on to his daughter. The birth of Clara and Thomas's own children had brought additional joy and fulfillment to their lives while also demonstrating Samuel's complete integration into their family as an older brother who had shown remarkable maturity and kindness in helping care for younger siblings who had never known him as anything other than their beloved big brother. The family's dynamic had been characterized by the kind of love and mutual support that had made their home a haven of peace and happiness that had been noticed and admired by everyone who had been fortunate enough to visit or observe their interactions with each other. The decision to leave Millbrook and establish their bakery in Hartford had been motivated not by any desire to escape their community but by Thomas's recognition of opportunities for growth and expansion that could better provide for their growing family while also allowing them to serve a larger community that could benefit from Clara's gifts as a baker and both of their examples as people committed to living according to principles of kindness, honesty, and service to others. The farewell celebrations that had marked their departure from Millbrook had demonstrated the complete transformation that had occurred in community attitudes, as townspeople had expressed genuine sorrow at losing valued neighbors and had promised to maintain relationships that had been strengthened by the experiences they had shared. The establishment of Hope's Bakery in Hartford had been an immediate success that had attracted customers from throughout the Connecticut River Valley who had been drawn not only by the exceptional quality of the baked goods but also by the atmosphere of warmth and welcome that Clara and Thomas had created in their new location. The name they had chosen for their bakery had reflected both Clara's role in providing hope for Samuel when he had been orphaned and abandoned and their desire to offer hope and comfort to everyone who entered their establishment, whether they came seeking food for their bodies or nourishment for their spirits. Clara's practice of telling Samuel's story to her other children as they had grown older had been part of her commitment to raising them with understanding of the importance of compassion for those who were different or disadvantaged and appreciation for the ways that love could create families that were stronger and more meaningful than those based solely on biological relationships. The children's pride in their older brother and their understanding of their mother's sacrifice had shaped their own characters in ways that had made them compassionate, generous young people who had carried forward the family tradition of service and kindness that had begun with their grandfather Samuel Whitfield and had been exemplified by their parents' choices throughout their lives. The success and reputation of Hope's Bakery had created opportunities for Clara and Thomas to expand their influence and service beyond their immediate business, as they had become involved in charitable activities that had provided assistance to orphans, widows, and other vulnerable members of Hartford society who had benefited from both financial support and the kind of practical help that had demonstrated genuine concern for their welfare and dignity. Their philanthropic activities had been conducted quietly and without seeking recognition, reflecting their understanding that true charity was motivated by love rather than desire for social approval or personal satisfaction. Samuel's development into a young man of exceptional character and ability had been a source of tremendous pride and joy for Clara and Thomas, as they had watched him grow into someone who had embodied the best qualities of both his biological parents and his adoptive family while developing his own unique gifts and interests that had prepared him for a life of service and achievement. His understanding of his own story and his gratitude for the love and sacrifice that had shaped his childhood had made him particularly sensitive to the needs of others who faced challenges or disadvantages, leading him to choose a career in education where he could help other young people develop their potential and overcome obstacles that might otherwise limit their opportunities. The grandchildren who had eventually blessed Clara and Thomas's later years had been the recipients of stories and examples that had taught them about the power of love to overcome prejudice and misunderstanding, the importance of making moral choices even when such choices required personal sacrifice, and the rewards that came from living according to principles of kindness and service that created meaning and purpose that transcended material success or social recognition. The family traditions that had been established around the telling of Clara's story and the celebration of Samuel's adoption had ensured that future generations would understand and appreciate the values that had guided their ancestors through difficult times and had created the foundation for their family's happiness and success. The community respect and affection that Clara and Thomas had earned through years of consistent demonstration of their values and character had been reflected in the positions of trust and responsibility that had been offered to them by Hartford's civic and religious organizations, providing them with platforms for influencing positive change that had extended their impact far beyond their immediate family and business relationships. Clara's particular involvement in organizations that had served women and children had drawn on her personal experiences and had been motivated by her desire to ensure that others facing difficult circumstances would receive the support and understanding that she had eventually found but which had been denied to her during some of her most challenging periods. The legacy that Clara and Thomas had created through their choices and their life together had been preserved not only in the memories of those who had known them personally but also in the institutions and traditions they had established that had continued to serve their community long after they were no longer alive to provide direct leadership and guidance. Hope's Bakery had remained a Hartford institution for generations, operated by descendants who had maintained the standards of quality and service that had made it legendary, while the charitable foundation they had established had continued to provide assistance to those in need while honoring the memory of people who had demonstrated that individual choices could have lasting positive impact on entire communities. The letters and documents that had preserved Clara's story had been treasured by her family as evidence of the power of love to triumph over misunderstanding and the importance of standing by our principles even when doing so required personal sacrifice that was not immediately appreciated or understood by others. The example of her life had inspired countless other people who had faced their own choices between easy paths that would have avoided difficulty and right paths that had required courage and commitment to values that transcended immediate comfort or social approval. Clara's evening conversations with Samuel throughout his childhood had been marked by her consistent message that he was not a burden she had accepted but a blessing she had received, a gift that had enriched her life in ways that had made all the sacrifices worthwhile and had taught her about the depth of love that was possible when it was based on choice rather than obligation. Her words to him about being her beginning rather than her burden had become family legend, passed down through generations as an expression of the kind of love that created rather than diminished, that built up rather than tore down, and that found joy in service rather than resentment in sacrifice. The influence of Clara's example had extended beyond her immediate family to affect the broader community that had witnessed her transformation from victim of unjust judgment to exemplar of Christian charity and moral courage, demonstrating the power of individual character to change attitudes and create positive change that benefited everyone who was touched by such examples of authentic goodness. The story of her return to Millbrook with Samuel and the community's eventual recognition of their error in judging her had become part of local legend, told and retold as an illustration of the importance of withholding judgment until all facts were known and of the need for communities to support rather than condemn those who made difficult choices motivated by love and moral principle. The broader impact of Clara's story had been its demonstration that the courage to do what was right, even when such choices were misunderstood or criticized by others, could ultimately lead not only to personal satisfaction and fulfillment but also to positive changes that benefited entire communities by raising standards of compassion and understanding that made such communities more welcoming and supportive places for everyone to live and raise their families. Clara's willingness to sacrifice her reputation and social position to care for an orphaned child had shown that individual acts of love could have consequences that extended far beyond immediate circumstances to influence the moral climate of entire communities for generations. As I sit here surrounded by Clara's letters and the evidence of the beautiful life she built from what seemed like ruin, I'm moved to tears by the power of one woman's choice to love unconditionally. Her story reminds us that our deepest wounds can become our greatest sources of strength, and that the children we choose to love are often the ones who save us as much as we save them. Clara's sacrifice for little Samuel wasn't really a sacrifice at all, it was an investment in love that paid dividends for generations. She thought she was saving him, but he was the one who saved her, leading her to a life more beautiful than anything she could have imagined when she first held him in her arms. What strikes me most about Clara's journey is how her willingness to be misunderstood in the service of love ultimately led to being understood more deeply than she ever could have been otherwise. The community that judged her harshly came to love her completely, not despite her choices but because of them. Thomas's love for her became stronger, not weaker, when he learned the truth about her sacrifice. And Samuel grew up knowing that he was chosen, wanted, and cherished in ways that most children never experience. Have you ever made a choice that others didn't understand but you knew was right? Have you experienced the pain of being wrongly judged, or the joy of having someone stand up for you when you couldn't stand up for yourself? Maybe you've been blessed to meet a child who wasn't yours by blood but became yours by heart. I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below, because these experiences of choosing love over comfort, truth over convenience, and sacrifice over selfishness are what make us truly human. And if you have suggestions for other historical stories that celebrate the triumph of love over judgment, please share those too. They help me continue bringing you tales that remind us all of the goodness that still exists in this world. If Clara's story has touched your heart and reminded you that our greatest trials often prepare us for our most beautiful victories, please subscribe to hear more stories of people who chose love when love was difficult, who stood by their principles when it cost them everything, and who discovered that sometimes losing everything we think we want leads us to everything we actually need. I'm Eleanor, and I preserve these stories because they prove that love is not about perfection but about commitment, that family is not about genetics but about choice, and that the most beautiful lives are often built from the rubble of what the world calls failure. Clara and Samuel's story shows us that sometimes the greatest gift we can give someone is the security of knowing they are chosen, wanted, and treasured exactly as they are, and that sometimes the greatest gift we can receive is the opportunity to love without limits and without conditions.